Hello, I'm Michelle Lavander, Director of the USC Center for Health Journalism. Thanks for joining us today and welcome to our Health Matters webinar, covering unrest when journalists of color become the target. This webinar is offered in partnership with the Maynard Institute and the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. We want to thank the California Endowment and individual supporters for making this webinar possible. Yesterday was the funeral of George Floyd. His brutal killing at the hands of police has launched what's being called the biggest civil rights movement of our time. Yet change can come at a price. We've seen how the protests have unleashed a violent police response in some cities, with hundreds arrested or attacked for protesting peacefully, and military police tactics that have landed many in the hospital. Journalists have also found themselves to be police targets. They've been arrested, shot with rubber bullets, and sprayed with tear gas and pepper spray. The arrest of CNN correspondent Omar Jimenez during a live shot was only the most visible example of dangerous police encounters for journalists. And the hazards they face go well beyond physical safety on the protest front lines. COVID-19 had already left reporters battling exhaustion and vicarious trauma. As protests engulf the nation, these stresses have hit especially hard for Black journalists and other journalists of color who are covering systemic racism against their own communities. They also face unique risks as journalists of color reporting on protests. In this webinar, we'll take a deeper look at these physical and mental health risks, strategies for bringing about change in journalism and newsrooms, and offer suggestions for staying safe while covering two overlapping crises. As we begin, the USC Center for Health Journalism, the Maynard Institute, and the National Association of Hispanic Journalists stand in solidarity with Black journalists and other journalists of color contending with the trauma of reporting on these twin pandemics. You can tweet about this webinar at the hashtag #CoveringCrisis. A word about our format today: we'll be hearing from our panelists first, and then we'll turn it over to our audience for questions. Because we have many people participating in this webinar, we'll ask you to write your questions in the control panel of GoToWebinar. You can write us there if you're experiencing technical problems as well. We'll be archiving this webinar at centerforhealthjournalism.org. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this webinar, Chinyere Amobi, the Center for Health Journalism's community editor.
Thank you all for joining us today for a topic that's dear to my heart as a Black journalist, but also as the broader community protests and covers the protests against the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others at the hands of police. I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Dr. Glenn Doran is Chief Medical Officer of 180 Health Partners, where she leads the health provider programs addressing the social determinants of health. Previously, Dr. Wren served as founding director of the Kennedy Satcher Center for Mental Health Equity at Morehouse School of Medicine, where she was also an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral science. Dr. Wren's research focuses on resilience and PTSD among urban residents and members of the armed forces. Carlos Martinez de la Serna is program director for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Prior to joining CPJ in 2018, he worked as a reporter and digital journalist in the US, Spain, Japan, covering issues including current affairs, biomedical research, and North Korea's nuclear program. He's also a former director of digital innovation at Univision News. Martin G. Reynolds is the co-executive director of external affairs and funding at the Maynard Institute. Reynolds is co-founder of Oakland Voices, a community storytelling project that trains residents to serve as community correspondents. He was also the top editor of the Oakland Tribune. Reynolds also had a career with the Bay Area News Group that spanned 18 years and serves as the director of the Reveal Investigative Fellowships from the Center for Investigative Reporting. Reynolds also conducts Fault Lines diversity training programs for media companies and colleges and universities. So we'll turn to Carlos now. Carlos, can you share what the Committee to Protect Journalists has been seeing and hearing during this time of national unrest about attacks on journalists and press freedom violations? Are these attacks on journalists at a scale seen before in the US?
Hi, thanks everybody for joining the webinar, and thanks Cynthia for the introduction. So what we are seeing is an unprecedented attack to journalists, basically. So at times what journalists are, you said, and in the introduction it was said, covering already the pandemic crisis. There's an overlap crisis here in the US with the most significant civil unrest in decades. And the same way we are seeing extreme violence to repress and allegedly control the demonstrations, we're seeing that violence applied to journalists. And from like a principles point of view, we are seeing First Amendment rights being attacked at the same time. So the right of the demonstrators to assembly, to protest, and the right of journalists to cover those demonstrations and bring the news to the public. With what I mean with unprecedented, I can give some numbers. So in 2017, the Committee to Protect Journalists and Freedom of the Press Foundation and other organizations created a project called US Press Freedom Tracker. So after a very heated presidential election where journalists were all the time being targeted all the time, and journalism was being undermined, especially from the Trump's campaign, of course. We thought, well, we don't have a baseline on really to compare the situation to other previous ones to really assess the severity of the situation. So we aim to create a collaborative project to be able to document all press freedom incidents we could in the US. So to give a reference, last year, in the total year, this project covered 150 incidents in the US, all kind of incidents. And in the last few days, I think we were 2 weeks already, right, since the demonstrations began and then spread to cities across the US, we recorded more than 405 total press freedom incidents. And this includes at least 58 arrests, which is outstanding. Physical attacks, and it's important to remark the vast majority are by the police, these attacks. 52 tear gassings, pepper sprays, rubber bullets, so journalists hit by rubber bullets, projectiles of all kinds. A very significant number of cases of where equipment, newsroom has been damaged, and other type of things. So we are confronting a crisis where journalists are being attacked. And let me put some examples maybe to understand what we mean with this. Like a journalist is standing in a sidewalk, just reporting and talking with some neighbors, and all of a sudden getting screamed at with a gun pointed at them by a police. There's no way to understand that. So it's not like they're being caught in the middle of a demonstration, they're being caught no, there's no way to understand that kind of behavior. When a journalist is being pushed to the ground by a police and hit by police, there's no way to justify that. There's no way we can understand that behavior. And the same we're seeing to demonstrators. It's important the police needs to protect the right of demonstrators to protest, protect the right of journalists to cover the events and bring the news to the public. So it's not like we can understand violence. No, this is the opposite world that we should be seeing. They should be able, all of them, to come together to demonstrate publicly and exercise the First Amendment rights, but we are seeing the opposite. So we've seen photojournalists in the front lines. It's always been hit. One photojournalist who lost an eye. And this is happening across 64 cities. So the protest started in Minneapolis, but still, where we have recorded more incidents, 66, but we are seeing incidents in 34 states in 64 total cities. So what we are doing is, sorry if I went too long answering your question, yet it was like, what we are doing is putting a lot of information together to help journalists try to mitigate and prevent these problems as much as they can. But as what I said, if police don't respect anything, you cannot do much, but keep reporting was what they're doing. And we are also providing advice in many ways, from direct assistance when they need advice, legal advice, health, newsroom equipment, and the direct assistance in these cases, from engaging to local authorities across these 640 cities in the US to ask for accountability and for these to sorry if I went too long.
It's okay. Carlos, can you share some of the stories you've heard from reporters who have been arrested, assaulted, or harassed while reporting during these protests?
So there's so many that I can speak about some of them, also some trends we're seeing, some patterns we're seeing. like photojournalists. That's a big story by itself. We recorded at least 60 and probably way more, but um, basically using data we can right now share with others. 60 photojournalists being hit and assaulted in many different ways. I'm thinking of photojournalist Linda Tirado from Minneapolis. She was reporting on streets. She was hit by a rubber bullet, lost an eye. When I was talking with other journalists in the same demonstrations, covering the same situation in a different place, but like same demonstration the same day, one told me, another photojournalist, a freelancer, that he was just seeing police sitting at the head level. So there is no way you can try to create any positive outcome out of that, right? There's no way to contend and to address the demonstration that way. So um, through these kind of testimonies, we can understand the situation a photographer like Linda Tirado faced, right? I'm thinking of the journalists I mentioned earlier, like two journalists from public media in the same city. They were in a sidewalk at the end of the demonstrations, like people were going home and things like that. They were just talking with neighbors and they lived nearby, they told me, and they were just, doing some, not even reporting, right? They're sharing things. People were very concerned about what they've seen. And they, all of a sudden, police, they don't understand why, got so enraged, started shouting, go, 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 and pointed a gun at them. So why is this behavior happening, right? Unfortunately, there's so many cases, and journalists of color are being more exposed, but that's obvious too, right? They're being targeted because I remember journalists working in Ferguson and in other places. They were being treated at, they were mistaken as demonstrators. I think that was a problem, right? But so their journalists being treated in mistreated, it would be the right word, as demonstrators, or they were singled out. We've seen testimonies of journalists. They're talking, I'm here, nothing's happening to me. This is my colleague, be a Latino or Black journalist, whatever, but journalists of color, and they are being attacked, they're being harassed by police. So this is so concerning at many levels that we're seeing probably the biggest and more concerning crisis of press freedom. But if I can add to these, we're trying to understand what's going on beyond being sucked, right? And trying to respond to journalists, trying to engage with local authorities. And definitely there's some trends here, some themes that are very concerning for us. One is the militarization of local police, right? For over a decade in the US, it's been accepted that the police respond to protests, confront protesters using highly aggressive methods. And this is leading to this kind of behavior that it seems some police feel emboldened to confront demonstrators and journalists using these methods. So, but also there's an administration that this is the fourth year already. It's been using the news journalists are enemies of the people narrative and cultivating these. This is coming from the Trump administration. This is coming from politicians at all levels. So again, there's a very important local theme. And there's we feel a very important local theme in terms of the situation of local media, the crisis impacting them in many ways. So we feel there's this very important local theme at many levels that needs also to be confronted as part of the crisis we're living in.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
And turning to Dr. Wren, right now, Black journalists reporting on the protests have to contend with their own personal responses to racism and police killings while still getting the reporting done. On top of this, journalists have experienced unprecedented violence at the hands of police. Can you explain the burden that places on mental health and how these high-stress situations can affect journalists' ability to perform?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. I mean, I'm still processing a lot of what Carlos has said. And I think that really speaks, the word that just kept resonating for me is a hostile work environment, right? And I'm thinking about embedded journalists that are embedded in the military, that have gone to the front lines and done military reporting. There's a significant difference even compared to that. They're in physical danger, but they're feeling like they're surrounded by at least one or a group of people that are also there for their safety. And that's not the case for journalists who are covering protests, because there's no one that's keeping them safe. And this is happening within a context of hostility towards journalism overall, which Carlos spoke to. And for journalists of color, they may literally be working in a hostile work environment. As you know, they are underrepresented in their field, much like many other disciplines, and may have to, at baseline, be managing overt and covert racism, microaggressions within their workplace. We've recently heard reports of journalists losing their positions and losing their ability to be able to write on these things because of their race. And what this creates are layers of vulnerability with respect to mental health. And I've done a lot of work with journalists around reporting on mental health specifically in communities and community violence. And there we talk a lot about the vicarious trauma that can happen from reporting on these events. And I think there's just so many layers of traumatic exposure, the traumatization of witnessing police violence happening in front of you, to being the victim yourself, to having a very limited network of support within your profession, to feel isolated and at risk, that even if I speak up and share, like, I don't have a place to process any of this. And we all have vulnerability in terms of our mental health. Every single one of us has to take proactive steps to ensure our well-being, our psychosocial, spiritual well-being. And we have all developed some form of a practice to do that, whether that's through faith or exercise or reading or community. The pandemic has strained a lot of those coping mechanisms. So that's another very important layer that people are working through. And if you haven't chosen to find your own path of whether that's getting professional counseling, you may not even have a vehicle to put words to these experiences. And when you're experiencing a trauma, think of a child who experiences a trauma. They don't have the language to put into words what is happening to them. The body then takes the burden of that trauma. So you may see it manifest in physical symptoms where there's no words attached to those feelings. So it's a very serious, multi-layer, multifaceted challenge. And I think it's so important that we're having this conversation today to start to put some words and labels to what we're seeing, to have people find themselves in these experiences and not feel alone, because being the only journalist of color in your newsroom, for example, you can feel very isolated. And so coming to a webinar like this and finding out about resources can be a very important step towards healing and recovery.
And Dr. Wren, your research focuses on building resilience, and you emphasize that building resilience is not a one and done thing. A person can still experience intense periods of mourning, grief, and anger. What can journalists do to continually build resilience? And should the onus be on them, or are there things that newsrooms and editors can do to check in and support their ranks?
That's such a great question. I'll talk to the individual aspect first. So, as an individual, I think it's really important for journalists to take an assessment, a self-assessment of where they're at. And there may be some people that are dealing with a normal response to this abnormal situation, and others that are actually experiencing more severe symptoms of depression, hopelessness, burnout, disengagement. It may even drive people to the point of feeling like, what's the point of doing this anyway? What is the point of living? Can lead to suicidality, can lead to substance use as a way to cope and disengage and shut off and shut the body down from being overstimulated, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder that can occur as a result of being directly subject to an incident or even witnessing these incidents. So taking some type of self-awareness, there's surveys you can take online. Mental Health America, if you go to their website, you'll see you can do surveys to see, like, identify actual conditions. But usually there's a trusted person in your life, hopefully, that you can also kind of check in with. Most of the times for mental health help seeking, we find that it's a trusted other that can be so influential in helping someone to recognize you're really not doing well. So if you allow yourself to be vulnerable, check in with someone that you trust to see how you're doing. That can be a really important first step. And then, so that's the foundation. And then building resilience is not just a characteristic that you have that's fixed and you either have it or you don't. You can build that. You can build that through a gratitude practice of reflecting every day on what went well, what things that you are grateful for. We know this from the positive psychology literature. But also there's something called real-time resilience, which I think really highlights the fact that resilience and stress is dynamic. We all have good days and bad days, and on my best days, I'm in flow, I'm operating with the peak of empathy, and I'm just, everything's coming up roses. And then something can happen that can really take me off of that state where I just have to practice real-time resilience. And it can be as small as like my kids have, gotten on my nerves and I've got to perform now, so I have to use some coping strategies to function. Or it can be as significant as, having to go into work the next day when you had an incident yesterday that you hadn't quite fully practiced. So there's a survival aspect of resilience, which is in the moment. Then there's the later work of flourishing and recovering. And that takes usually connectivity with others, whether that's individual therapy, whether that's a peer group of journalists. It may even only be one person that's a colleague of yours that you speak to regularly, that you process these issues with. And that's part of healing. I talk about bearing witness to trauma. We've learned so much from, Holocaust survivors and the power of projects like Shoah, the power of even what we're witnessing today as a person of color, to see non-persons of color have what I see as their eyes are opened. It's one thing to read about it and hear about it, but I feel like many people have had their eyes opened, and I feel validated and seen. Like, wow, just bearing witness to adversity is a very powerful healing mechanism. That's partly why talking, connecting can be helpful, because you can have someone be outraged over a situation that you're in, that if because of stress and our coping mechanisms, we kind of freeze up and you just survive and you're doing your job, and journalists are supposed to be objective and you're not supposed to have your own feelings about it, right? Like, you've been trained in this certain kind of way. And then when it hits you and you tell your partner about it, and their eyes are, and they're going all crazy, like, that's validating, because, the part of you that does feel is seen and acknowledged, and it can really be a very helpful part of processing these events, especially if you're exposed to them on a regular basis.
And turning to Martin, can you tell us a little bit about the unique challenges that Black journalists and journalists of color are facing right now covering these protests and police brutality?
I think what really stands out to me right now is that there's a struggle that is happening in the street that in many ways, a struggle for pushing against systemic racism, a struggle against disparities. And that struggle is actually in many ways being mirrored in America's newsrooms. There's been generational lack of diversity in news organizations. And as Dr. Rand talked about, working in mainstream American news has absolutely been a hostile work environment for so many journalists of color for decades. Since the first time that Dorothy Gilliam, the first African-American woman reporter to walk into the Washington Post in 1963, and she's one of the Maynard Institute's founders. And so the unique challenges that folks are facing is that we have, as people of color, as Black people, have felt the trauma of this violence that we've seen, have experienced it ourselves in many instances. And now what we are seeing is this playing out in the streets. And what ought to be an opportunity that news organizations that are lucky to have Black journalists working in them to be taking advantage of, we are finding in some instances, folks are being pulled off of stories because they are being told that they cannot be objective. That's like saying that, then I guess that means white people shouldn't be able to cover anything then, right? It's ludicrous to think that any of us are objective. We are not. We talk about this in our trainings where we all see the world through the prism of race, class, gender, generation, geography, and the sexual orientation and the social fissures of politics and religion and ability. And how you align across those social fault lines impacts how you see the world. It shapes your biases, which manifest themselves into microaggressions. And so none of us are objective. What we can be is fair. And this false binary that has been taught in American journalism schools is completely outdated. And I would argue actually dangerous. It's dangerous because it doesn't provide the opportunity for who people are to be taken into the stories in which they do. And the fact of the matter is that already happens anyway. It already happens in decisions that are made, what sources are legitimate, what stories are legitimate, what angles are legitimate, what perspectives are legitimate. It manifests itself within the gaze in which journalism in the mainstream sees these issues and our people. So, I'm hopeful, however, because I think as there is struggle in the streets and people are pushing back, you see in these newsrooms at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, journalists at the Philadelphia Inquirer who are pushing back and calling for action. And I think that there are certain management that are hearing that. Others may not so. But I think this is a moment, and in many ways, I would argue that the soul of certain segments of American journalism are at stake in this moment. And it is a tipping point for us to move past the inability of our profession and to make good on the call that the Kerner Commission laid out 50 years ago, that they called out journalism explicitly for its lack of diversity. And we are still seeking to meet that goal of having newsrooms reflect the diversity of the nation. And my hope is this will be a tipping point as it is around the conversation around funding of police.
Thank you for that. And do you have any tips, Martin, on how journalists, specifically Black journalists, can navigate between, just as you mentioned, their personal beliefs on all that and their race themselves, but also reporting in a way that doesn't get them accused of bias? Are there any tips for, we see journalists that are getting sanctioned for sharing their unfiltered thoughts on, say, social media. How do they find that balance, but also how do they talk to their newsroom, and how do they explain essentially what you just said?
Well, I mean, part of it is our job to help do that on behalf of them. Also, NABJ has been very involved. But I think one of the ways you can do is sort of get ahead of the conversation and sit down with an editor and begin to discuss this a bit and talk a little bit about what this story means, what you have an opportunity to bring to it. But I think I also want to push back on that notion a little bit, because it always seems to be incumbent upon us to explain our legitimacy. And the fact of the matter is, this isn't a problem that we created. So it's like, it's always ironic to me that I'll be on these kinds of panels, and it's essentially white people asking, how can we solve racism? And the reality is, y'all got to ask yourselves that. And so what I would say to editors is actually for themselves. I mean, yes, journalists, what tips can I give them? I mean, it sort of depends on your news organization, who is an ally that you have there. Hopefully you have a mentor. Is there an older editor, perhaps an editor of color who you can go to? Sort of building those mentor-mentee relationships, ally relationships, getting ahead of this, proposing stories in advance, being mindful of what you're saying on social media. So all of those strategies are important. But I think that then puts the onus on the individual. It puts the onus on the person whose legitimacy should not be questioned in this moment. This is what inclusion is about. This is why you want to have diversity, because diversity without equity, diversity without inclusion is window dressing. So I want to put it on not journalists of color to have to fight this battle. I want to fight this battle with them, in service of them, and in service of the newspapers and news organizations that play such a vital role. This is an opportunity. We all need to be present to cover this story and to understand the value that we all bring to that.
Thank you. And this could be answered by all of you, really. What topics are legitimate and important for newsrooms to cover right now and going forward? And how can journalists of color, and really all journalists, have that conversation with their newsrooms?
Somebody want to take that? I just ran my mouth.
I'm happy to just give some quick thoughts while Martin drinks a little water. I would just, there are many things that can be covered, but definitely I would advocate for covering press freedom itself and having journalists of color covering that. How they feel, I think it's important to explain what is press freedom, how do you exercise your rights. It's not a privilege of a group. It's a right for every American to, and journalists are part of that mechanism to bring the news to the public. It's not everybody can be there and also making sense of that thing. And press freedom is an important thread in this story because it's let me bring an experience outside of the U.S. So most of our work happens usually outside of the U.S. I'm not American myself, and I spent years here already in other places as well. And so it's the First Amendment creates an idea of the foundation of journalism in the U.S. It's not always in other places, right? And how we see that under attack here sends such a terrible message for other countries that has these First Amendment and the press freedom enshrined in the U.S. as a strong principle, also as a beacon of an idea, also that it's so debilitating for the idea of the United States. We even believe with all the struggles, and like many people have explained, and I love New York Times Nicole Jones project on this idea of the United States that embraces the real struggle, right? So it's important sometimes for me to think about how would I look like at what's happening in the US from other countries. And this is a terrible message. So if journalists in the US are working under a hostile environment, what can we say to countries like, and I can start naming countries after countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Brazil, just in the same hemisphere. And so the importance of what's going on, press freedom is I believe a fundamental thing to address during this crisis.
One thing I would suggest is, and looking at it more from a systemic perspective. So I think journalists have to ask themselves, are we part of the problem? And that our traditional mainstream journalism organizations, essentially agencies or institutions of structural racism. And I think we can say the answer is yes, they have been. They co-create with police. They have themselves excluded journalists of color from top positions in many instances, or for reaching a level of parity. And so I think the point that I make in talking to traditional journalism organizations now is to actually come to a realization. It doesn't mean that people in them are racists, but there is an ambient racism that exists within these institutions and has for many, many years. And the time has come to essentially accept that and then put in structural mechanisms to begin to address it. Because if we are not pushing back against that in our coverage and pushing back against it in our structures, then we are essentially complicit in this larger system where this struggle is underway now to push against. So to that end, as it relates to coverage topics, I want to see more stories that are based on solutions around addressing systemic racism. I want to see stories about what are white people doing to educate other white people about pushing back against racism. I think that would be a really powerful and important story to show the faces and the people who actually need to really work with their folks to address this, to tell those stories more broadly and to see them. I'm sure they're being done, but they're not coming across my feeds. Another one is to think about collaborations with ethnic media. Ethnic media play a really important role, and they have relationships and trust in communities that mainstream news organizations don't have or have eroded, particularly in local markets over time. So there's a real opportunity to connect with ethnic media and build some collaborations that can help, because ethnic media has trust, has connections, often is under-resourced. Even traditional news organizations that have been eroded over time still have broad reach and have far more resources than many ethnic publications. And then last but not least, I would say news organizations need to think about connecting with community organizers and activists to have a more ongoing conversation about how they would like to see stories covered and framed, not because you're going to let them drive coverage, but because I think it's an important message to send that you are listening and seeking to learn and understand. And then also, lastly, community organizers do something really well. They galvanize people around issues, and it can build trust in communities. Those are techniques that news needs to understand at a time of great distrust against our industry.
Can I add something as a non-journalist?
Oh,
I will second Martin's point around structural racism, because this is something that I think most people can acknowledge historically the existence of structural racism and that there were people perpetrators of creators of the system. But what their debate comes in terms of the lack of recognition around the fact that we're still today living within systems and structures that created the scaffolding where we all live, work, and play. They exist today, and they are actually actively sustained in some settings. They are passively facilitated in most cases, and in a lot of cases actively denied. So that denial, those categories are where we need to get people out of those categories and into the category of dismantlers of systemic racism. And I think this notion of it's not enough to not be a racist, you have to be anti-racist, we can build on that to say it's not enough I'm glad that you're to the party of recognizing that structural racism still exists, and that, oh, look at this example within the criminal justice system. Yes, I acknowledge that that's still here today. That's not good enough. Acknowledgement is insufficient. The system will not reform itself because it has been seen. It will not dismantle itself because it has been protested against. It will only change if it is actually restructured, rebuilt, dismantled. And that's a very big challenge, one that is too big for any one group, definitely too big for a disempowered, impacted, oppressed group to take as its mantle. It will only happen with collective action. We all have a role to play in that. I think journalists are so powerful in their ability to create that narrative and create that shared consensus around narrative. And as Martin said, with connections to community and community engagement, to facilitate conversations, which are not just about lifting up certain voices, but it's about facilitating learning and dialogue and insight and understanding. And I've had conversations with people, they're hard conversations to talk to someone that doesn't quite agree or continues to talk about rioting and can't quite see any other issue besides that. But those are the places where I think journalists can really step in and facilitate that dialogue and help us all to evolve in our thinking, process new information through different frames. So I really encourage all of you, and I'm very excited about the interest in supporting journalists, because if we can't support the people that are most vulnerable in this effort, then I think it'll be a lot harder to see sustained change happen.
Thank you. Great discussion. And we're about to come up on our questions portion. So if anyone in the audience, if you have questions, please do write them in the question little box on the side. And I just wanted to ask one more question before we switch to that. Technically anybody can answer, but I just want to make sure that journalists walk away with practical tips about how they can physically protect themselves before and during protests. If anyone has insight on that.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I think I got some noise and I couldn't hear the full question.
Yeah. How can journalists best protect themselves during protests, before and during?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I was at the Oakland Tribune, in Oakland, California, there's a lot of protests, and one of the last ones I oversaw was for coverage was Occupy, and then of course there was Oscar Grant, there was a lot of protests. And so we sent out a lot of our reporters out into the streets. And some of the tips and guidance we often gave was obviously to stay on sort of the edges of large crowds, often to be very aware of where police are at all times. Depending, the challenge that I've seen over recent years has been there's been this, and this Carlos alluded to this, there's been sort of this uptick in aggression towards journalists. So for photographers, for instance, carrying less equipment because cameras are a real draw and a target. For journalists, for those who have the luxury of not necessarily having equipment that calls them out, it's really just being mindful of your surroundings, having your credentials visible. But I also think that some of the rules that applied before, because it always felt like there was an understanding with police and journalists that we're kind of both here doing this work. And it feels like there has been a level of animosity that has ratcheted up. So I think an increased amount of vigilance is required, so that the norms that were once, accepted in terms of how you engage with police, you could go talk to a sergeant, hey, I'm over here. There's sort of, pre some conversation, you may know a few of the officers there, you're sort of building some relationships. Not to say that some of that doesn't exist, but when you have multi-agency response, so you're not necessarily going to know everyone that's there. I just think being exceptionally vigilant. Maybe you might need a helmet, you might need some goggles now. I mean, a lot of people are wearing that. And essentially, not putting yourself in danger, and being able to read the temperature of the crowd when things are going to get hostile. Are the police beginning to gear up? Is posture shifting? Is the energy shifting? I mean, it's so many things about being a journalist that are sort of, it's about feel. And so I think being aware, being mindful, staying on the fringes, and minimizing your amount of equipment so that you're nimble and mobile are some suggestions I would make.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would totally reiterate what Martin was saying, and just add some tips. Like as Martin was saying, there's an increased need to extreme the precautions, right? So working groups and watch for each other, right? So you're in these large demonstrations, you might not be able to do it all by yourself. So make sure you have a plan to work in groups so others you can share information quickly. Have a simple way to report back to your newsroom and get some support, or at least a check-in case you get into trouble quickly, right? So you never feel alone. And another aspect I will call is digital safety, right? Right now, it's not possible to separate your physical integrity from your digital safety. So do your check-in and don't have any personal information online. Try not to expose any your family and your close contacts to, because this can be a target today, and we've seen that in people covering, for example, far right. These physical safety tips or advice, but also digital safety, we cannot separate. And I'm sure Dr. Brent can add a lot in terms of your own preparation for this, right? But I'd like to add one thing. It's very important to do these things, and it's very important also to change the narrative, because journalists are reporting, and it's police who needs to protect them. So at the same time, we all need to mitigate the risk and prevent the risk. We cannot accept by any means like this is a hostile environment. We cannot accept that. We cannot take these as for granted. We need to go and talk to the police as organizations and tell them what the hell is going on here. Police cannot, journalists should be able to go and cover these demonstrations like feeling safe and without other concern, but doing a great job, right? Which is already hard. So these two things, we need to emphasize all these things and help them be secure. But we need to change the narrative that the police need to protect them, not only not harass them or attack them. They need to protect the right of journalists to do their job, the same way they need the right of protesters to demonstrate.
I do have something to add to this, even though the question was about physical safety going in. I think the process of going out is just as important for your mental safety in recovering. And if you're just going to work and going into this environment, coming home like it's any given day, you're probably not doing enough to be proactive, to allow space to disengage, to process, to allow yourself to become a full being again, because you take off certain hats when you go to work. We all do. And so there's a process that might need to be a little bit more intentional if you're covering these high conflict environments. And there's a lot of pathways, whether it's, mind, body work or spiritual work, but something needs to happen. You can't just keep going in and out of work every day like nothing's happening to you, because it will show up, it will catch up if you don't do anything preventive.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll get to the questions from the audience now. The first one is from Ciara Encinas. She says, I am a Latina journalist. Just moments before going live, my photojournalist, also Latino, was assaulted, and the man who decided to attack our team was not an officer. For backgrounds, we were at a safe distance away. It was a protester whose mood changed quickly. It seems as though the protesters don't want us at the protests. How can we make the public comfortable with us covering these important events? That's a good question.
That's a tough one because I also think that the view of the press has begun to change as well over time. When we used to cover these protests in downtown Oakland, I would often have to go down to the office because our windows were constantly getting smashed on the street. And here I am, an African-American editor who cares a lot about many of the issues that folks are protesting about, as did my colleagues. And especially when it had to do with against police violence. I mean, none of us were okay with what was happening. And yet we were perceived as part of the problem. And this goes back to the fact that journalism institutions have been complicit in a way in terms of being facilitators to Dr. Wren's wonderful framework of sustainer, creator, denier, facilitator. I'm going to steal that just so you know, but I will give you absolutely credit all day long.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. But are we, we haven't been viewed as dismantlers. We've been probably viewed as facilitators, perhaps even deniers, and certainly in a lot of instances, sustainers. So I think some of that is on us. And I don't know how to solve it. I think it's like there used to be a deep reservoir of trust in American society. Back when Gallup assessed this back in the early 70s, like almost 72% of people said they trusted mass media. Now that number is like maybe 28% who have some trust or not trust. I might get the numbers, but it's like 13% have very little trust and 28% have some trust. And I could be inverting the numbers. The bottom line is it's really gone down. So I think part of that has been our approach to coverage and to community. And I don't know how to solve that in the instance of a protest.
Thank you. And Vanessa Maria Graber says, I am in Philadelphia and I have been covering the protests and been on the front lines of the fires, destruction, and violence from police. I feel when I am out there, I am fending for myself. I often do not see other media on the ground getting the story. How do we protect ourselves? What support should managers offer to those of us putting our lives at risk? We are then expected to turn a story around quickly without regard for the trauma we've just experienced. It feels like we have no support.
Mm-hmm. Carlos, you want to take that, or you? I have thoughts. I think security is one. I think news organizations need to think about buddying up, as Carlos said, and thinking seriously about providing their teams with some security. That happens now. You look at CNN teams; they have security out there. So I think there needs to be some new strategies about this, and there probably needs to be some mental health professionals working in newsrooms at this time. Like they say, well, we've got the EAP program, you can call them up, but I think it needs to be more proactive. Managers need to really think holistically about this and understand that and provide ongoing security so that folks can focus on the story and then somebody is there watching their back that isn't just a journalist, right? Because journalists, what are you going to do? Wave a style book around and flag people off? That's not how it's going to work. So there needs to be much more of a strategic approach. The TV, I think, has this down because people got equipment that particularly print publications. The question is, what about freelance journalists? And I think in that situation, the buddy system is going to be key. And maybe the publication that you're producing content for, there should be conversations about that, about what they may be able to provide.
Yeah, so as Martin said, I think this is a very important question. It's critical to be strategic about security, right? So not to improvise. We can think about that in many ways, but one of them is planning, having security protocols in place. And I understand there's a challenge for smaller publications or freelancers, but get in touch with us if you have that problem. We're giving out personal advice all the time. We're happy to help you find resources at local level. We partner all the time with organizations. We're part of a much larger network. So we're happy to help this foster this conversation and also connect you with resources. Check our website, get in touch with me with that, and I will help as much as we can. Something that Martin said and is in the question, and it's very concerning to me, is the feeling of being alone, right? That's in this situation can be huge weight on you at many levels. So find your peers and find the groups you can work with if you're a freelancer or you don't have a local organization. And again, if you don't know where to start, you get in touch with us and we'll work with you on trying to support you the best we can. But at least we'll be on the other side of the line.
I have one thought too. There's kind of in terms of if a manager or a newsroom wants to support journalists in that process of processing their experiences, you don't only have to go to the EAP route. You can also bring something into the upfront process, creating a process group and having a licensed behavioral health counselor come in and facilitate that group, having that be a standing meeting that occurs. It would be an example of a proactive approach to create an environment to have conversations specifically to process emotions and feelings around the nature of what they've been reporting on. And if that's not something that you're in a position to create or ask for, to then create that within a peer environment. And I think that could be especially helpful for freelancers to connect with a peer group or an alumni group, or find some peer group where you get together and you meet and you talk, and the purpose of that allows you to have that support. And it's helpful to have it be scheduled, because you never know when you're going to need it. And so if you wait until you're distressed, chances are you're going to not do anything, right? You're going to just try to survive that. So if it's a standing meeting once a month or whatever frequency, that will make it a little easier to access when you really need it most. So those are some other ideas.
Thank you. And this is from Jose Neil Donis. In my case, in Louisville, Kentucky, some readers are claiming that the protests are part of the Democrat agenda and that we are helping them. What kind of approach should we have to this type of attitude from readers, for myself and for our newspaper?
I mean, I don't know that you can. I was going to say something that's probably not appropriate, so I'm probably not going to say it. I mean, I just don't think you can fix uninformed, right? And so I wish I had some better advice for how to fix that. I mean, I think speaking calmly, saying, I think, just identifying yourself. I work for this publication. These are some of the issues that we cover. I'm here to capture this story. So, being courteous, being professional. I think that's all you can really do, is just represent yourself as a professional. But again, this goes to the erosion of trust that across this nation, across many major institutions, and we are a part of that. But I just think having a conversation, maybe trying to pull somebody aside, de-escalate, don't get defensive, stay calm, say what you have to say, and say, thank you, here's my card. If you feel free, if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to have a conversation. So just be open, be transparent, I think, and courteous, and then just step away.
It also may be good to think about that as in the context of community engagement. And, a lot of times this narrative, especially at the mainstream journalist level, again, I'm an outsider, so I'm just a consumer of your product. But, you're looking for recognizable names. And I always appreciate the stories of, people interviewing actual protesters, like, why are you here? what's your story? So maybe not the headline grabbing news headline of someone that's famous or well known, but drawing more attention to the real experiences of people and how it's impacted them. Because I think the conspiracy theories live within ambiguity at a stage. It's like not my neighbor who I'm eyeball to eyeball and have to reconcile. This is my story. It's not going to prevent those comments from coming, but it can be part of, again, that more activist role. I don't know if you all view yourselves as activists, but I think there's probably a little bit of your identity that if you're passionate about a certain topic, it's got to come from somewhere. And so, that's not always putting your words in print or doing a video story. Sometimes that's the work that you do as a citizen within your community to lend your voice to these issues and try to, facilitate meaningful conversations.
Thank you. And Celia Clark asks, should we be asking for more mental health options, coverage from our employers or unions? It's everything from therapy sessions to reimbursement and time off for something like yoga, for example.
Yes, big surprise, and I'm going to endorse that. So looking at your benefits policy might be a good place to start to see, if you have EAP benefits, how many sessions does that cover? What type of health coverage do you have? And does the coverage, is there even parity for mental health compared to physical health? A lot of companies and organizations do think about this and have been thinking about, workforce productivity and absenteeism and presenteeism and burnout. They recognize that these have significant financial costs, and most employees aren't even aware of the benefits that may be provided. So especially if you're part of a large organization, you probably have access to things, free yoga, free Calm app subscriptions, little things like that. Smaller organizations may not have made that type of an investment, but now would be a good time to bring that up to ask, are there some additional benefits? The time off piece is really critical, because if you have the benefit, but you're worried about losing your job and all you have is FMLA to protect you, that's not really an environment that recognizes the importance of making that investment. I'm a psychiatrist by training, and I talk to residents and learners about the fact that we're the instrument of healing in our craft. And so it's critical for us to maintain our well-being. I could argue that the same could be said for journalists, that you very much have to be a participant observer in your craft. And so if you as the instrument are impaired, then you're not going to be as effective in the work that you do.
Thank you. And this is a long one. It says, I am half Iranian, half Nicaraguan, a freelance reporter. The last news outlet I worked for full-time hired me partially because there's a significant Black and Latino population in the region they cover. My editor told me on day one that the newspaper depends on mugshots to gain clicks on the website and extend time spent on web pages. I had a problem with this because most of the mugshots are of Black and Latino men, and most of the newspaper readers are white. Not only that, the newspaper will write about just about any felony case that appears on record, no matter how newsworthy it really is. As one of only two people of color in the newsroom, I could not get it through to my white editors explaining why these click tactics are wrong, especially considering the demographics in my region. I ended up quitting because my editors couldn't see anything wrong and tension built up between us. I still believe this implicit bias in the newsroom hurts covering race issues and events like the ongoing civil unrest nationwide. As a person of color, how can I effectively propose change in the newsroom and therefore promote better coverage of race issues and civil unrest? That's a meaty one.
Yeah, that's a meaty one. I can take a quick crack at it. So if you look at on Twitter today, Manny Garcia, who works at ProPublica, actually just announced that, or did a whole thread about how Gannett just pledged to stop publishing mugshots in the paper. At least sort of writ large, like in felony cases that they are going to pursue and cover. But there's a whole thread by Manny, and so there's a whole push underway now to stop using mugshots and covering these running these police blotters, because so often charges are never filed. So often, if you're not going to, and there's other publications that are now adopting this practice, that we're not going to publish the mugshot of a case that we're not going to follow from beginning to end, because what you're doing is you're overrepresented because more people of color are generally swept up in being arrested and charged, or arrested at the very least, and overrepresented in these stories. You're creating this perception of Black and brown criminality. But so I would say this person can actually point to specific. I mean, Gannett is a large media corporation, and now that it's pledged, according to Garcia, to stop covering these things with that, except within the exception of cases, serious felony cases, fraud cases, is an important and exciting development. The answer about what can an individual do, I mean, it's really challenging. I think one of the things you can do is to connect with your local identity organization. So the NAHJ, AAJA, NAJA, NABJ, most of them have local chapters. So that's a place where you can plug into folks that are in your region who can provide some support and some push for you. So I think that's one key way to do it if you're one of only a couple in your newsroom.
Thank you. And this is from Isabella Van Treese. As a college student, I'm wondering, what can college students who are aspiring journalists take away from these events to better prepare them for their future? How can we prepare ourselves for this new level of hostility?
Well, that's rather ominous, isn't it? How do you prepare for new level of hostility? Well, you could not go into journalism. I'm kidding. No, I mean, public relations is like considerably more safe. No, I'm kidding. Anybody want to take this? Come on, Carlos.
Yeah, I'll try. So I don't want to try to, I mean, I don't know, foresee what might happen in the future, right? But it's never easy to be a journalist, because it's not a great answer. But I would say there are many ways you can prepare yourself for hostile or challenging environment, right? You need during your training as a journalist, you learn how to report, but also you need to learn how to take care of yourself. You need to learn how to connect with others, how to cope with emotions, the very challenging sometimes, and you need to learn how to protect yourself. So there are all these measures you can take to be the best journalist you can as you keep learning, and that will mitigate and help you be better prepared. As Dr. Bren was saying, we're bringing ourselves to work, so it's not like all those things you need to take care of also, and connect with your peers, connect with your community, connect with your local at any level. That's always I think very important at many levels, also for your personal growth, right? So I don't know, when I started reported in my 20s, I went and was reporting on biomedical research, and I was reporting on some vaccine in East Africa. And I was, at some point, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just not prepared at many levels. I could, emotional, so some point you realize that, and then you just learn to take care of yourself and to try to connect with people at a deeper level and embrace those emotions and embrace those things. As I don't have the struggle of being a journalist and activist, because I'm an activist. Journalist by training, but I'm an activist. I don't have the problem. But probably trying to address that at the beginning of your career, it's also useful. So I would say, don't address it. There's a pointless discussion. Just connect with people, connect with yourself, learn how to take care, and embrace the challenge. And it's going to be a challenge, I would say. It's going to be hard, but the things you can do, and also embrace it, because that's a good, I think, a good way of living, even in spite of all the difficulties.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing, I think this is an opportunity. I think students coming up now, so smart, so bright, so driven. If you're going into journalism now, you really have something about you that is special. And so I think, there's been generational work to get to this point. So there's those of folks like Dorothy Gilliam and the founders of the Maynard Institute, Bob Maynard and Nancy Hicks Maynard, who sort of set this course back in the 60s to get to the place where they were the first ever in their newsrooms. Then there were the others that came behind them. Then there was my generation that began be able to be top editors at news organizations. And then there's millennials, folks who've been holding it down since then. And now there's going to be younger millennials, right, coming up, and then Gen Z behind them. And Gen Z is going to come in and just like rock the world. So I just think that there's a movement happening in the streets. There's a movement happening, I think, in journalism right now. This is the moment. And so my hope is that that moment can help pave the way and help for those young folks coming into this space now. But I think there has to be a willingness to sort of have some skin that's tough. You got to have some leather. If you're going to be a journalist, you can't expect to walk into a place and be like, oh my God, what's going on? There's got to be a measure of toughness and a measure of compassion. You have to walk this line of strength and softness at the same time. So I would think about how to navigate that. And also you can feel free to reach out to the Maynard Institute as well, and we can have deeper conversations about that. But softness and strength, that's what one needs to have as a journalist.
And this is another question from a student journalist, very similar to the one you just answered, but just wanted to share it, from Gabriela Miranda. She says, as a student journalist, a Latina student journalist, coming back to my university in the fall, it doesn't feel right to go back to the journalistic roles of remaining objective and not being able to speak on the recent protests, Black Lives Matters, and the Black community. Do you have any tips on how young journalists can go about dismantling these roles?
I think I missed the first part of that question.
Yeah, so as a Latina student journalist coming back to my university in the fall, it doesn't feel right to go back to the journalistic roles of remaining objective and not being able to speak on the recent protests, Black Lives Matter, and the Black community. Do you have any tips on how journalists can go about dismantling these roles?
Well, I would say that looking at Lewis Raven's, I'm getting the name wrong, Lewis Raven Wallace's book, A View from Nowhere, which is a really great book about objectivity. I would suggest getting a hold of that and then like sharing that with your the staff counselor, the facilitator of your program, and really actually just initiating a conversation. Maybe you can talk to some of the journalism professors there, have a look at this book, or you read the book yourself and at a staff meeting, bring it up and say, let's have a conversation. I think just being really direct with it, because objectivity doesn't exist. And, we're happy to have a conversation as well. We do trainings for colleges and universities, because objectivity is a dangerous framework and it doesn't exist. We are not objective. How we align across the fault lines shapes our perception of the world. What we need to strive for is fairness. So my tips would be look at that book, bring that book, initiate a conversation.
And this is a question for Angie Trinidadi. As a Mexican-American journalist, I am disappointed in the angle certain Latino TV news have taken in covering the protests. I've seen them focus more on the looters than the meaning of the protests. It is doing a disservice to Spanish speakers in the US. How can we keep our communities educated in seeing the bigger picture?
I'll try to answer that, even if it's not my current focus, but get in touch with them, get in touch with the newsrooms. I know a lot of great journalists that work there, and they're going to be happy to hear from you and help that also, or use that to help drive a conversation inside the newsroom. So as Martin was saying, newsrooms said there's a movement happening in the streets. I will credit you, but I like this line, Martin. So there's a movement happening in the street, there's a movement happening in newsrooms too. And so this is an ongoing process, and all these students or just citizens that are concerned about what they're seeing, they can get in touch with the newsrooms, they can get in touch with people. And I know for certain that these Latino, mostly publications are very welcome to, always welcome in the comments and the feedback from the community. So do that and start that conversation, help that start that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. I love that you guys are quoting each other here within the conversation.
Hey.
Pulling phrases. This one is from Kara Newhouse. On Martin's suggestion of showing solution stories about white people working to dismantle systemic racism, that the burden isn't only on communities of color, how does that balance with calls to center Black voices and not giving white folks praise for work marginalized communities have already been doing for a while? And this is from a white journalist, she specified.
Well, because they're totally different. I mean, yeah, we don't want to, I don't think it's giving praise just because, I think that would have a lot to do with how you frame the story. I mean, if you come in with the whole hero program, I'm like, look at this, then that's problematic. But if it's sort of very matter of fact that as we are looking at this issue, these folks are doing this, this is what's happening, and this is how you can plug in, that's not praise, that's information. So I just think if it's a column that's, waxing poetic about how these white folks are sort of, being champions of diversity, and they just started this program 2 months ago, like, then maybe you're not going to get too much credit. So I just think framing it as information and then providing people a way to plug in is not praise, it's information, and it's fine. And I think as you write the story, you could even say, there are these groups run by these, folks of color who've been doing this work forever, and, you give credit that way. So I just think being mindful of it.
Okay, thank you. And I'd love to keep this conversation going, but I want to be mindful of our panelists' time. So that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank everyone who joins this webinar, and especially the panelists for this great discussion. Shortly after this webinar, you'll be all receiving a survey asking for feedback on the webinar and how we can make other webinars in the future better. And also, if you'd like to support future webinars like this, we'd greatly appreciate it. No amount is too small, and you can text 41-444 and type in CHJ for further instructions. Our survey will also include information on donating. So thank you, everybody, for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank
you so much.
Stay positive, test negative.
Exactly.